Urgent warnings. Dr. James Hansen, head of the U.S. NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, warns that even the toughest CO2 emission standard target currently in force needs to be lowered to assure planetary survival. He states, "What we have found is that the target we have all been aiming for is a disaster, a guaranteed disaster."
Australian scientist Dr. Professor Ross Garnaut warns we have limited time and options for climate change. His research calls upon Australia to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as much as 90% by the year 2050.
Over 600 scientists from across the United States addressed a letter to Congress urging immediate passage of a bill that would lower emissions by 65%. In their letter, the scientists stated, "Global warming represents by far the greatest threat ever posed to the planet's living resources."
Former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair states we need to act aggressively in the next 2 years, saying, "We have reached the critical moment for the decision on climate change. Even on the mildest application of precautionary principles, failure to act on climate change now would be deeply and unforgivably irresponsible."
At the opening of a 2-day General Assembly discussion on climate change, United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urged developed nations to start the drive to counter global warming effects. He highlighted the need to encourage new kinds of cleaner technologies, industries, and jobs, and integrate climate change risk into national policies and practices.
Dr. David Archer, professor of geophysical sciences at the University of Chicago in the U.S., stated, "I personally think that we've already passed a danger limit. The amount of sea ice in the Arctic Ocean has been decreasing over the years, but then, in 2007, it just crumbled. And the earthquake activity and the acceleration of flowing ice in Greenland, I think these are signs that we are already in dangerous territory."
Observing consequences of the warming trend in the U.S., which includes more frequent wildfires, massive tree die-offs from insect infestation, glacier melt in Montana, and severe water shortages in several states, Stephen Saunders, president of the Rocky Mountain Climate Organization, said, "It's already begun. We are already seeing the effects. And scientists are telling us it's going to get markedly worse."
Greek scientist Demetrios Lalas stated, "We have seen an increase of temperatures during the summer by 6 to 7 degrees Celsius over the past few years, while the average increase in temperatures in other parts of the world have been 3 to 4 degrees Celsius."
Recent research by Greenpeace has concluded that rising sea levels, diminishing water supplies, and altering monsoon seasons due to climate change could lead to 125 million Southeast Asians becoming homeless.
Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon agree progress on climate change is too slow.
The European Commission identifies risks of tsunamis as directly related to climate change in Morocco, Norway, Iceland, Spain, and the Eastern Mediterranean, and is developing an early warning system to safeguard residents.
Dr. Ted Scambos, lead glaciologist at the University of Colorado in the U.S., stated, "In the poles, anybody who works in polar science, nobody questions whether we are in a warming world. We're in trouble because we see it in our fields every year. And ice plates that have been there for 10,000 years since the end of the last ice age are gone because the climate got that much warmer. And just in the last 20 or 30 years, it got that much warmer."
In speaking of the Scottish coastline eroding into the sea due to climate change, Richard Lochhead, Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and the Environment, said, "These are happening now and we must take action."
Climate change experts believe England, France, and the rest of Northern Europe will experience 20 to 30% more rain in intense bursts, leading to greatly increased chances of severe flooding.
Tipping points. The United Kingdom's National Academy of Sciences identifies the 9 regions of the planet most critically threatened by climate destabilization, all of which are experiencing severe stress. The main tipping points include
melting of the Arctic ice caps, melting of the Greenland ice sheet, collapse of West Antarctica's ice sheet, die-off of the Amazon rainforest due to desertification, collapse of the Indian summer monsoon, die-off of the northern boreal forest.
Tipping points 1 to 3. The Arctic Ocean, Greenland ice sheet, and Antarctic are disappearing at alarming rates, exceeding even worst-case scenarios.
From the data on the 2007 summer melt season in the Arctic Sea, a growing number of scientists have concluded that the sea ice could be gone sometime between fall 2008 and 2012, 30 years earlier than previous aggressive estimates. The scientists making these predictions include Dr. Jay Zawali, an Earth Observing System project scientist at NASA, Dr. Louis Fortier, Scientific Director of the Canadian Research Network ArcticNet, and Dr. Olav Orheim, Chief Scientist of the Norwegian International Polar Year Secretariat.
Scientists at the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, announced that the older, thicker Arctic ice now makes up only 30% of the polar ice cap, representing a 30% decline over the past 20 years.
Scientists at the University of Bern, studying ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, have determined that global warming during the past century was the greatest compared to the past 22 millennia, with the rate continuing to increase.
In March, Western Antarctica experienced the disintegration of the largest ice shelf 15 years ahead of predictions, alarming scientists at the speed at which it fell into the ocean. Tipping Point 4. The Amazon rainforest is under siege.
Nearly 20% of global greenhouse gases originate from deforestation, with cleared lands being used primarily to graze livestock, raise food crops for animals, or raise biofuel.
Brazilian Dr. Jose Marengo and colleagues have concluded that climate change caused the worst drought in Amazon history during 2005, leaving the tributaries of the Great Amazon River dry.
The Livestock Environment and Development Initiative within the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 70% of the Amazon has been cut down for meat production.
Tipping Point 5. The Indian monsoon season has grown increasingly erratic.
More unexpected patterns in the Indian monsoon have led to catastrophic events.
In 2005, a single day's rainfall on July 26 flooded Mumbai with a record 944 millimeters and 1,000 casualties.
In 2006, the late arrival of the monsoon rains in the Marathwada region of Maharashtra state caused flooding, which swept away 400 villages and led to the loss of 700 lives.
Devastating floods in 2007 led to over 19 million people being displaced and over 1,300 lives lost over India and Bangladesh.
Tipping Point 6. Permafrost melting in boreal forests is releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, factors which are not currently accounted for in climate change forecasts.
The UN Environmental Program, or UNEP, called for urgent research into the danger of methane gas being released from thawing permafrost, which threatens to drive climate change faster than current expectations. Executive Director of UNEP, Achim Steiner, said, "The unknowns about the amount and rate of methane released from the thawing Arctic makes it a wild card when considering climate change risks."
Scientists are concerned that bacteria in the soil of formerly frozen regions, like the Arctic, will increase the carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere as they become more active in the warmer climates. Soil stores twice as much carbon as the atmosphere. Dr. Eric Davidson, senior scientist at Woods Hole Research Center in Massachusetts, USA, said, "There's a sort of a time bomb, in my view, waiting to go off. There's a huge stock of carbon stored in permafrost, and that is all subject to relatively rapid decomposition if that permafrost melts."
With warmer temperatures melting the permafrost under their feet, the residents of Sault-Louis of northern Quebec, Canada, consider moving their entire town away from the mudslides and sinking buildings and roads.
Native Alaskan villagers seek reimbursement from companies known to produce large amounts of greenhouse gases to help them move their village, which is built upon melting permafrost.
Temperatures in the boreal forests of Siberia and Alaska have been increasing at twice the average temperature rises in other parts of the planet.
Dr. Katie Walter, assistant professor of limnology at the University of Alaska, confirms that methane is being released from melting permafrost and bubbling up from frigid Arctic lakes. Dr. Walter says, permafrost is like a time bomb waiting to go off. As it continues to thaw, tens of thousands of teragrams of methane can be released to the atmosphere, enhancing climate warming. She also states that 950 gigatons of carbon gas is trapped beneath the permafrost layer of Siberian lakes, more CO2 than is in the atmosphere today.
NASA climate expert Jim Hansen states, "In past eras, the release of methane from melting permafrost and destabilized sediments on continental shelves has probably been responsible for some of the largest warmings in the Earth's history."
Climate-related health issues.
After the flooding in England last summer, veterinarians have seen a dramatic surge in the incidence of deadly diseases affecting pets and wildlife. They indicate that humans are also at risk, as some of these diseases can jump the species barrier.
Doctors from the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, Ontario, report that the habitat range of disease carriers, like ticks and mosquitoes, will soon expand throughout the heavily populated areas of Canada because of global warming.
A report issued by Stanford University in California, USA, has confirmed a direct link between rising levels of CO2 in the air and increased human mortality.
A new World Health Organization report says that severe weather and natural disasters can lead to a variety of stress-related mental problems and even suicides.
Indonesian Health Minister Siti Fadila Supari stated that 150,000 people die every year in the country due to climate change-induced illness.
Dr. Jeffrey Demain of the University of Alaska explained that climate change was beginning to affect public health in the northernmost U.S. state, with more vector-borne illnesses.
A recent report from doctors in the British Medical Association, or BMA, states that global warming could introduce diseases such as malaria to the United Kingdom, as well as disorders such as skin cancer and sunstroke resulting from increased heat waves.
Doctors for the Environment Australia have released a report explaining the serious effects of climate change on human health, from heat-related and extreme weather illnesses to increased allergies and diseases carried by mosquitoes.
Climate change-induced drought, biofuels, and demand for meat are creating food insecurity, unrest, and hunger. Reasons:
UK newspaper The Guardian states eating meat is a main cause of world famine and malnourishment. In an article, Why Vegans Were Right All Along, non-vegetarian investigative journalist George Monbiot explains how demand for meat by the world's wealthy pushes the price of grain too high for the less fortunate. Because it takes over 5 pounds of grain to create 1 pound of meat, every meal, including meat, directly takes food out of the mouths of the poor.
The head of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, Dr. Rajendra K. Pachauri, said that climate change is endangering food security, due in part to melting glaciers.
Lester Brown, president of the U.S.-based Earth Policy Institute, states that the demand for biofuels is also pricing the less fortunate out of the market, as farmers plant and sell crops for fuel instead of food.
With rainfall having decreased by 20% over the past 35 years and reserves at 10% of capacity, the island of Cyprus is experiencing a historical water shortage.
UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Jean Ziegler, calls for a halt on the production of current generation biofuels, saying they are a crime against humanity because they are causing global food shortages and leading to global hunger.
UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has asked for a second look at biofuels as an alternative energy source, in light of the effect their production is having on global food prices.
Current status.
The rice-producing nations of India, China, Oman, or Vietnam, and Egypt are placing export limits on rice, pushing prices up even farther.
Food riots have erupted across the world, from Mexico to Egypt, from Mauritania to Haiti, with several people dying in breadlines in Egypt. In India, many millions have reduced their meals from 2 to 1 per day. And in El Salvador, the meals are less than half now compared to 2 years ago. Solution 1. Reduce methane. Reducing our methane footprint may be the most important step we can take to rapidly halt the pace of climate change and buy us critical time to heal the environment.
NASA climatologist Jim Hansen says that we may be able to save the Arctic sea ice if we reduce methane. He states it's very important to realize that it's not only carbon dioxide. Dr. Hansen explains that methane is having a greater impact on warming the Arctic than CO2. Methane is at least 25 times more potent than CO2.
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, lists the #1 source of human-caused methane as raising animals for food, followed by landfills, coal mining, and leaks in natural gas systems.
The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization estimates animal raised for meat account for 37% of human-caused methane.
Avoid eating meat. Earth scientists across the globe state that the single biggest step an individual can take to reverse global warming is to stop eating meat. Dr. Chris Rapley, director of London's Science Museum and former Antarctic survey leader, advocates vegetarianism, veganism to save the planet, saying that it uses far less energy than a meat-based diet. Therefore, a key aspect of the climate change solution is vegetarianism, veganism. An EarthSave.org report, How Environmentalists Are Overlooking Vegetarianism as the Most Effective Tool Against Climate Change in Our Lifetimes, states that methane should be acknowledged as an important cause of global warming, one that could be easily reduced if people adopted a vegetarian-vegan diet. Solution 2. Government and media to encourage vegetarian-vegan diets.
Animals raised for meat create more emissions than all the transportation in the world combined. A report published by the Livestock Group within the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization found that livestock accounted for 18% of total greenhouse gas emissions. The report further stated that growing animals for food was so damaging to the environment that reducing their impact should be a top environmental policy for all governments.
According to environment reporter Andrew Revkin of the U.S. newspaper The New York Times, our food choices are also essentially energy choices to some extent. And actually, in terms of vegetarianism, there are other values that are in there as well. There is a lot of water. There is a lot of pollution that results from large-scale farming. So eating down the food chain is something many scientists feel in a growing global population is something that would be important.
Dr. Kirk Smith, professor of global environmental health at the University of California at Berkeley, member of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, states that governments should tax meat to reduce its consumption and bring down methane levels.
Formosan, or Taiwanese, Minister of the Environmental Protection Administration, Mr. Winston Dang, recommends that people should eat less meat in order to protect the planet from global warming and to conserve water and land resources.
German legislator Renat Künast recommends changing agricultural policies to halt climate change, including a reduction in the consumption of milk and meat products.
Senator Andrew Bartlett of Queensland, Australia says, there is no easier, cheaper and more immediate thing we can do to significantly reduce our personal contribution to greenhouse emissions than to cut the amount of meat and dairy products that we consume.
The Camden City Council in London is proposing to ban the serving of meat at its staff cafeteria as part of efforts to reduce emissions.
Canadian journalist Kate Hartfield suggested that Canadian provinces begin taxing meat to reduce greenhouse emissions, saying that we talk about carbon dioxide so much, we forget that it's not the only greenhouse gas or even the most dangerous one. Livestock rearing does release carbon into the atmosphere, in particular through the raising of forests. Cattle need a lot of land and food, but that's nothing compared to the scary amounts of methane and nitrous oxide emitted by cattle herds and manure.
Mr. Pa Ousmane Jarjou, Director of Water Resources in Gambia, stated, "Our diet system also needs to change. If we go in for vegetarian type of diets, that would also contribute immensely to save the planet."
Per Holmgren, Swedish television meteorologist and lecturer on climate issues, stated, "If more and more people eat more and more meat, that will create a big problem because of the energy, because of the fact that some of these animals are actually eating food that we could eat, and also the problem of the animals creating greenhouse gases."
A New York Times article written by Mark Bittman, a non-vegetarian, explains the detrimental cost of meat consumption to our planet, our health, and to the poor.
Solution 3. Adopt zero carbon standards.
Dr. Arjun Makhijani, president of Washington, D.C. USA think tank Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, reports that it is possible for even a large economy such as the U.S. to go carbon neutral by using existing technologies. He states, "A goal of zero CO2 is necessary to minimize harm related to climate change."
The cost of wind energy today is comparable to nuclear energy without the toxic waste or security issues.
Transportation accounts for 13% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Environmentalist and founder of the Step It Up Foundation, Bill McKibben, states that aside from walking, riding a bike, or taking public transportation, electric plug-in vehicles, scooters, bikes, and trains appear to be the most environmentally friendly solutions, given existing technologies.
Offset programs through organizations such as carbonfund.org are available to help reduce carbon emissions.
Monaco offers cash incentives to her citizens to encourage the purchase of green cars.
Conserving energy is the cheapest, fastest way to bring down energy usage, including putting in triple glazed windows, sealing all leaks, and insulating your home.
Install solar panels for electricity and a solar water heater.
Solution 4. Reforestation.
300 climate experts from around the globe signed a declaration at the UN's Climate Change Conference in Bali, stating, "If we lose the forest, we lose the fight against climate change."
Reduce your junk mail. The average household in the U.S. receives enough junk mail and catalogs to deforest the Rocky Mountain National Park once every 4 months. Companies such as www.greendimes.com help people to reduce over 90% of junk mail and replant 1 tree for each catalog that is cancelled.
In Owen Sound, Canada, the Trees Ontario group teaches people tree planting techniques and introduces them to the Managed Forest Tax Incentive Program, which offers up to 75% reduction in property taxes for tree planting to offset global warming.
On April 1st, 2008, letter from Dr. James Hansen to Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd states, "We are at a point where bold leadership is needed, leadership that could change the course of human history. Aggressive, near-term fostering of energy efficiency and climate-friendly technologies is an imperative for mitigation of the looming climate crisis. Feasible actions now could still point the world onto a course that minimizes climate change."
We have to save this planet so that we'll be able to stay first. Because if the ice all melt, if the pole all melt out, and then if the sea is warm, then the gas might be released from the ocean, and we all might be poisoned by the gas from the ocean.
Be veg, go green, to save the planet. For more urgent details, please see suprememastertv.com/SOS.